Hi everyone. A very warm welcome. I was just waiting for the recording to fully start. So, my name is Sahana Virajan, and I'm really delighted to welcome you all to the seminar series. I hope you are all able to see and hear me. This series is a collaborative effort. It's co-hosted by the Center for Neurodiversity Studies at OP Jindal Global University, India, and the Center for Neurodiversity and Development at Durham University. So, Debbie is there from Durham, and I'm here from Jindal. We sort of came together with a shared vision. We wanted to create a space, a dedicated space where we can have critical and compassionate conversations about neurodiversity. And our aim has been to sort of, move beyond the established narratives and to contribute to whatever dialogues are already there, which explore and try to understand the complexities which are there in the lived realities and experiences of neurodiverse persons. So I'm just going to give a quick overview of how the last few months have gone, right? So over the past months, we have been really fortunate to host a remarkable group of speakers. So we have had Dr. Mary Hanley from Durham University. They shared their work, impactful work, translating research into practice for schools through the AAA intervention. We had Dr. Amy Pearson, who presented work on understanding and addressing interpersonal violence experienced by autistic people. We also had Dr. Dawn Adams, who guided us through pathways to well-being and mental health for neurodivergent individuals. Bole Shiana joined us. She was the founder of Autism Madagascar, who offered perspectives on inclusion and empowerment in Madagascar. We recently had Dr. Masahiro Hirai from Japan, who presented fascinating research on cross syndrome research on social and sensory profiles in autism and Williams syndrome. And most recently, I think we had Rafaela Christine from Brazil, an activist academic, who talked about the anti-ableist, autistic movement in her country. So these conversations have largely crossed boundaries and crossed continents. And today we are really happy to continue this journey after quite a bit of break for 2 months. We have the pleasure of hosting Dr. Francisco J. Ortega. Dr. Ortega is a research professor at the prestigious Catalan Institute of Research and Advanced Studies, also known as ICREA, and is based at the Medical Anthropology Research Center at the University Virgili, Tarragona. I think I really butchered that name, but his talk today, it's titled Beyond the Brain, a Pragmatic Negotiation of Nosological Categories, the Case of Autism in US, Italy, and Brazil. His work challenges us to sort of look beyond the rigid polarizations that sort of dominate discussions about autism, such as biological versus relational, mental suffering versus disability. And I think, and just please do correct me, I'll just hand over to you soon. He focuses on the nuanced everyday negotiations which sort of take place on the ground. He looks at the systems of care which are there in United States, Italy, and Brazil, talking about how mental health professionals, families, and neurodiversity activists pragmatically navigate and often transcend these binaries in their daily lives, right? So we are really happy to have you here. Thank you so much, Dr. Francisco Ortega, and over to you.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. I really would like to thank you, Sahana Rajan and Deborah Rivi for the kind invitation to speak in this Neurodiversity Global Seminar Series. I'm really honored to be here. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm gonna share my screen. Let's see if it works. Good. Does it work? Can you see it?
Perfect. We can see your screen. Maybe once you do the slide.
I put it now on the slide mode.
Brilliant.
Okay, you can interrupt me at any time if the connection is not right or you don't hear or something like that. Sometimes you don't feel that cases or you cannot see the slides or something like that. Just please interrupt me. So the presentation I just titled Beyond the Brain, Pragmatic Negotiation of Nosological Categories, the Case of Autism in the United States, Italy, and Brazil. Dr. Sahana made a very nice introduction on what is about, so I just go direct to the topic. Autism and global mental health. Autism has recently become a major global mental health priority. Specifically in the developing countries, individuals with autism and their families are more vulnerable due to poverty, malnutrition, violence, stigma, and scarcity of services. The Global Mental Health Agenda for ASD aims to generate cross-national evidence on prevalence, treatment services, and human resources. Global mental health initiatives for autism recognize alternative, what they call community-based and culturally sensitive approaches from low and middle income countries and reject what they call one-size-fits-all approaches for autism research and interventions. So on the one hand, we have that, and yet they are cautious of what they call approaches already dismissed by research, such as psychoanalysis, which are still in use in several countries in public mental health services, such as France, Argentina, and Brazil, one of the countries where I want to speak and where I live for more than 25 years. Mm-hmm. So we see that there is an important tension between, on the one hand, the need for culturally sensitive and community-based approaches to autism research and treatments, and on the other hand, the dismissal of those approaches when they fail to match the standards of evidence-based practices and interventions. In some countries, like Brazil, psychoanalysis constitutes a widely used methodology for autism spectrum disorders within public community mental health services. So these tensions around culturally sensitive approaches and global mental health claims to scale up and generalize those interventions are evoked in a range of views on autism and options for treatments in the United States, Italy, and Brazil. And I think these three countries illustrate how global issues and controversies around autism take local form and how ideas of autism are negotiated pragmatically. So in this presentation, I argue that the notorious polarizations around autism may hide important negotiations and spaces beyond such antagonisms. Examining systems of care delivery for individuals living with autism in their historical and social contexts enables us to see how binaries and polarizations such as global versus local, organicism versus anti-organicism, biological versus relational, or mental suffering versus disability are challenged and transcended through the pragmatic negotiation and integration of those binaries in the everyday work of those affected by the condition. Autism as a problematic category. Controversies around autism's etiology, treatments, and policies emerge at least in part because autism constitutes what Charles Rosenberg called problematic category as most of psychiatry diagnosis, or a contested illness, exposed to public negotiation by medical and non-medical actors. For some people, autism is a form of mental suffering, for others, a mental disorder, or even a brain disease, but also an intellectual or relational disability, or even a different way of being based on the brain's natural diversity. The debate surrounding the condition extends out to other public spheres, involving not only professionals and families, but also activists, health advocates, lawyers, and virtual social networks. In the absence of lesions that we don't have, we don't see in autism, or of a biological root, and in the face of uncertainty regarding etiology and the best form of care, status and treatment remain open fields of dispute. Psychiatrists, psychologists, and neuroscientists primarily describe autism as a neurobiological disorder. Still, structural and functional neuroimaging findings, I quote, seldom provide data on an individual level, do not yet have well-accepted standards of replicability across time or site, and have rarely addressed questions of the specificity of findings to ASD. End of citation. Neither is there consensus about the methodology to be used in clinical interventions. In other words, and despite considerable amounts of research, there is still no convincing, well-replicated brain-based autism biomarker with clinical utility utility. Still, as Claude Silverman writes, autism has retained its identity as a genetic disorder of the brain. Conditions such as autism are immersed with debates about their legitimacy and medical, social, epistemic, and ontological status. They generate legal arguments, administrative categorizations, and legislative maneuvers. Those who bear these illnesses and their caregivers thus often become activists, mobilizing facts in favor of the condition's legitimacy and forming groups through which they share their experiences and fight for rights. Controversies around appropriate treatments, service organization, and allocation of resources are often depicted as a conflict between evidence-based standardizable treatments and interventions designated in developed countries versus alternative, locally developed approaches from developing countries. However, reducing the issues at stake in this way conceals as much as it reveals, occluding the possibility of alternative frameworks and the complexity of conditions on the ground. The local and historical particularities of the three national contexts, US, Brazil, and Italy, alongside the everyday practice of mental health professionals, make the abstract, globally circulating ideas meaningful in particular forms. Moreover, they illustrate how the same outlooks on treatments, interventions, service organization, and mental health policies may be beneficial in some contexts and damaging in others. Italy and Brazil, they share a similar tradition of psychiatric reform and processes of the psychiatric deinstitutionalization. In fact, the psychiatry reform in Brazil follows the Italian model of reform psychiatry. It was very important, the Italian psychiatry for the democratic psychiatry for Brazil. Unlike these two countries where they share this similar process of reform, unlike these two countries in which clinical and mental health agendas largely go hand in hand, public mental health care in the United States conforms to a biomedical model and promotes biomedical and pharmacological treatments for mental complaints, which are frequently in conflict with advocacy and activist movements' emphasis on social inclusion and citizenship rights for individuals with autism. In each of these settings, we see how conflicts and controversies arise between different biopolitical structures, each with their own set of histories that inform the conceptual frameworks upon which their interventions are grounded. Perhaps more significantly, though, we also gain insight in how we might transcend the terms of these conflicts instead of continuing to be limited by their dictates. What we see from approaching the autism landscape in the three countries is a pragmatic attitude regarding diagnostic entities, etiology, services, treatments, and policies, which are negotiated by different actors inside and outside health services. It serves to shift the terms of autism debates, taking conceptual binaries and reorganizing, challenging, or integrating them within the everyday practices of the different actors involved, be parents, mental health professionals, and individuals living with autism. Polarizations endure by serving social, political, and personal purposes. Defining what autism is in opposition to what it is not is frequently a means of advocating for the allocation of particular resources. In Brazil, there is a battle over autism at the level of public mental health discourses and policies, opposing two understandings of autism as mental suffering or as a disability. Brazilian psychiatric reform, as I said, was inspired by the Italian anti-psychiatry movement and Psiquiatria Democratica, which was led by Franco Basaglia in Trieste, and the Lacanian-inspired institutional psychotherapy program of Laborde in France. The psychiatric reform falls into the context of the country's redemocratization after the military dictatorships and the social political mobilization at the time. The dictatorship ended in 1985, almost 20 years of dictatorship. Brazilian mental health policy originates from the psychiatric reform law, which was passed in 2001. And what the psychiatric reform law establishes is the deinstitutionalization of psychiatric patients and development of community mental health care centers. The CAPS system, CAPS from psychosocial care centers, which centralize mental health care and are responsible for treating severe mental disorders, among them autism, and to articulate the liaison with primary care units. The principles of the community health centers in Brazil, the CAPS, are basically the idea that one should not frame mental health policy according to specific diseases or to a specific diagnostic. So it's against the diagnostic logic. Instead, they advance the notion of citizen burdened by mental suffering. So instead of any specific diagnosis, schizophrenia, autism, substance abuse, etc., the idea is that is not important. What is important is the general idea that they are citizens who suffer, who mentally suffer. So citizen burdened by mental suffering replace any particular diagnosis. So at CAPS, diagnoses are a continuous process. Its aim of this diagnostic process is the singularity of the child. That is the importance of psychoanalysis, the stress of the singularity of each child, her history, family, relationships, and everyday life, resulting in the notion of amplified clinic ampliada. So the diagnosis is something that is done and redone all the time and not something definite for a person. The idea is that about that to avoid stigmatization is the argument. So mental health network in Brazil resists diagnosis and specific services for autistic individuals. On the other hand, they are the parents' associations that generally disagree with this idea, with this principle of CAPS, of not framing services according to specific diagnosis. They want a specific service for autistic children. They argue that autism is a very severe condition that requires very specific and multidisciplinary services. They also argue that CAPS they don't respect the idea of a clinical theoretical diversity in autism treatments, specifically in some regions of Brazil, like Rio de Janeiro. Lacanian psychoanalysis advanced a discourse of self-sufficiency and exclusivity of treatment for autistic children in CAPS. So they say children are treated exclusively with psychoanalysis, despite the idea that treatment should be multidisciplinary oriented and etc. Against that, this idea of autism as mental suffering, remember the idea, citizen burdened by mental suffering. Against this idea that public mental health services follow, there is no diagnosis. Autism is a form of mental suffering like any other. They advance the discourse of disability. They saw in the logic of disability a way to get out of the mental health system and come into disability system where they can argue for specific services for autistic children. So they championed the idea of autism as a disability, which is associated with diagnosis-specific services, evidence-based treatments, and a stand against psychoanalysis. The pressure that those parents exert led to the proclamation by the at the time 2012 President Dilma Rousseff of the so-called autism law, which, among other things, which created policies for protecting the rights of the person with autism. So on the law, the article number 2 say the person with ASD is considered as a person with disability for all legal purposes. That is important, this idea, for all legal purposes, because it will become a polemic issue. Parallel to these developments at the time, especially more a decade that was very, very intense around a decade ago, there have been critiques of psychoanalytic treatments of autism in public services by those parent associations. They argue that psychoanalytic-based services do not possess proven efficacy. They are not evidence-based. Remember at the beginning that I spoke about autism and global mental health and the dismissal of psychoanalysis because it's not evidence-based. So they just graph this global discourse on autism. On the other hand, psychoanalysis comes and has to defend, in defense of what they call, I quote, a series of actions aiming to disqualify psychoanalytic approaches to treat persons with autism. Many members of the Brazilian psychoanalytic community insist on the rhetoric of war, of conflict, further entrenching a polarized discourse. For instance, Luciano Elia, a Lacanian psychoanalyst, believes that, I quote, only psychoanalysis has proven to be effective in making important developments in autism care and research. And he thinks that behavioral psychologists are pseudoscientists supported by, I quote, managers of the technocratic right wing and of compulsory institutionalization, and supported also by the middle classes that, quote, crave for a hygienist and fascistoid social order. So I believe the antagonistic understandings hamper serious discussions and cooperation between mental health professionals and parent associations. What is worse, it divides already scarce resources, which are designated for the same public, the autistic children, between two different networks, each network with its own services. The mental health networks with the CAP system where autistic children are treated, the disability network with their own specific service unit for autistic children where they are treated basically with behavioral cognitive therapy, ABA, with almost no interaction between these two forms, these two networks of services. Of course, not all parent associations in Brazil are against CAPS. And what is more important, despite the discourses against diagnosis and specific services, CAPS gather children together with practical purposes. According to criteria of what they call the children's profile, they say we are not diagnosis, but when you go there, you see that many autistic children are together because they share a similar profile, which in practically and frequently leads to diagnostically homogeneous groups and activities. Parents in Brazil display a pragmatic attitude when they demanded specialized services. It is not an ideological issue that opposes the universal logic of public health, but a pragmatic view of services and treatments, which may be approached solely by the practicality of gathering the different professionals in one single facility. One mother who says, we keep going back and forth with these kids. A mother living in one of the most vulnerable municipalities of the state of Rio de Janeiro. She said, for us, it's very tiring. Can't you imagine how it is for the autistics? We take the child to school in one place, a psychologist in another. The speech therapist is far away. CAPC once a week. All these professionals are in different places. So if we had all of them in one place, it would be much simpler. Beyond ideological controversies, the election of community mental health or disability-oriented services by parents interviewed in Costa Andrada's ethnography is related to practical reasons, so that some of them may even send their kids to both types of services, mental health and disability, to go to both. Why not both? Said one mother. There are so few places where I can take my son. You know, in one place they fix one part of my son's problems, and in the other place they take care of other problems. So we see that views of autism are mobilized by parents and professionals according to specific ends. Reparative, I would call this as reparative ethnographies, help to understand how individuals resort to etiologic conceptions, treatments, and healthcare services according to their needs without commitment to any presumed true nature of the condition necessarily linked to certain treatments and services. Parents also exhibit a pragmatic attitude when asked CAPC professionals for medical reports and diagnosis in order to get the disability compensation which they are entitled under the new autism law. So if they with this law, they can claim, for instance, some benefits like free ride on buses if you have an autistic case. So if you are very poor, that is very important. So you can only take your kid to CAPC if you have money to pay for the bus, because frequently people live very far away. So one professional say, I think you have to be careful, Jess. You have to do something else before you give the diagnosis. They are against diagnosis, don't forget, most of them. But I also think the team takes too long, declares a CAPC professional interviewed in Sousa's Lima's ethnography. And he adds, the professional, parents talk a lot about it. I understand that you do not want to label, but the world requires the labeling. For you to enter a school, you need an ICD-10 diagnosis. If you do not take the ICD, International Classification of Disease, normally in primary care and community service, they don't use DSM, they use ICD. The school will not accept it. So, well, they need it. You cannot be there for a year and keep saying, we do not want to give a diagnosis. We don't know what to label you, to label your child. Okay, you have to be careful, but you have to understand that the school is asking for such things, says the parent. So we see here that the acceptance of labels with pragmatic ends does not involve any epistemological, ontological, or etiological commitment to the true nature of autism. Professionals in Brazil would be well served to keep this in mind, recognizing that medical reports alongside an autism diagnosis are a parent's right, not to mention that most of the parents live in conditions of extreme social vulnerability, frequently residing far away from the CAPs, and with no or even little money for public transportations. CAPS professionals could benefit if they adopt this pragmatic attitude as well. At times they do, as when they arrange activities and groups to fit children's profiles, as I mentioned, or profiles of ability and developmental levels. At the level of public policies for autism, the so-called autism law can also be interpreted in the same reparative and pragmatic perspective. Thus, the law, article number 2 of the law that I already quote, stated that the person with an autism spectrum disorder is considered as a person with disability for all legal purposes. The law, in fact, establishes that autism is a disability rather than a mental form of mental suffering. But it also adds for all legal purposes, which substantiates its pragmatic nature. So, for certain ends, in some situations and contexts, such as obtaining medical reports and thus economic benefits and other accommodations, autism can be interpreted as a disability. It does not involve a commitment, neither epistemologically nor ontological, to the real nature of autism, but it does offer the possibility of mobilizing the category for all legal purposes. It is a way for parent associations to pursue the right to health, which is in the Brazilian Constitution, the right to health, beyond the universal logic of public health care by assuming the global discourse of disability rights. The law is a pragmatic way of attaining not only specialized healthcare for autistic children, but also social and educational inclusion. Actually, some professionals welcome the notion of disability for legal purposes, as defined by the autism law, to get social and educational inclusion among other benefits, as focus groups with CAPC professionals in Rio de Janeiro illustrate. However, ontological stances run deep, sometimes contributing to the obduracy of conflicts even between groups committed to an integrative approach. For example, As a recent ethnography with mental health professionals CAPC in Rio de Janeiro evinces, even professionals who are not psychoanalysts draw on psychoanalytic terms to describe their work. Or even more bluntly, some professionals criticize the psychoanalytic discourse that blame the parents, while at the same time they largely draw on that discourse to interpret clinical case. Psychoanalytic approaches thus continue to be extremely prevalent in settings and among practitioners committed to eclecticism and integration. Parents don't seem to worry too much about whether autism is a mental disorder, a neurobiological disease, or an intellectual disability. Etiologic conceptions and public health services are mobilized according to their specific needs, where they live, they have this service or not, etc. The acceptance of labels with pragmatic ends does not involve any ontological commitment to the nature of the condition. In autism debates in the United States, polarizations also serve a purpose. The polarization between many parents and professionals who frequently use an aggressive rhetoric and claim for biomedical interventions, and on the other hand, neurodiversity advocates opposing genetic and genomic research and biomedical treatments for autism obstructs meaningful dialogue around the best way to provide for the needs of people living with autism and their families. The rhetoric emerging from the neurodiversity movement tends to homogenize neurodiverse brains and minimize their difference so as to support the claims for the existence of a brain-based autistic identity. Thus, the autistic brain is displayed as ontologically homogeneous and radically different from the also homogeneous neurotypical brain. So that is common to all forms of identity politics. You are homogenized within the group. We are similar against our enemies, against the other, who among others, they are all similar. So there is not interested to see the difference between our group. But the different against the other group. Autistic identity politics draw on neurology to justify and naturalize differences between autistic and neurotypicals. All autistic brains are this way, and they are radically and biologically different from the other because we are wired in a different way, as we see in many discourses on front of neurodiversity self-advocates. The emphasizing intra-group difference is not important, the difference among autistics. What is important is the difference with neurotypicals. That is the real difference, where we are really different. And that is a natural difference. It's not it's socially constructed as being natural. In doing so, boosting polarized dichotomous rhetoric. For instance, autistic self-advocate Jane Mayerdin 20 years ago explained that she has, I quote, come to believe that the categorization of people into separate boxes labeled Asperger's syndrome and autism or high-functioning autism is seriously misleading. And she now prefers to identify herself as autistic, period. Just autistic. That is the idea. We are all just autistic in front of the other. Of course, emphasizing commonality within the spectrum of autism constitutes an important political move that would counter the critiques of several parents and professional groups who accuse them of speaking in the name of all autistic. That we see in this debate. They say, many parents say, well, you speak in the name of all autistic, but you are very high functioning, and my son is very low functioning. You cannot say the same thing, and you cannot say what you claim. So, but if you are in the movement, what is political, the best political attitude is to say we are all the same in front of you. That is the idea. However, when we move beyond that polarization, I mean, that polarization we see in autism debates and online research. So it's not, I'm not taking stances. I'm just saying how the debate look like. My idea is to advance reparative approaches to surpass these dichotomies. When we move beyond that polarization, we begin to see nuances, chiaroscuros, and pragmatic negotiations and integration that challenge and transcend those divides and tensions. Rather than digging into the rhetoric of war and oppositions, it is more productive to investigate carefully the multiple ways different actors engage with autism according to, I quote, the position from which they stand and the types of claims they seek to gain. In
So,
fact,
Dr. Ortega, I'm sorry, sorry to, I just wanted to give you a heads up, but there are about 5 minutes left. So, sorry, just
just 5 minutes left? It's
yeah,
not 40 minutes? Okay,
yeah. Okay,
I go quick.
yeah.
In fact, neither all parents oppose self-advocate movements, nor do all autistic adults take stances associated with neurodiversity. Some self-advocates display a pragmatic attitude toward medical interventions that does not fit neatly within the neurodiversity paradigm. The latter sometimes find it difficult to combine their identities as autistic within the autistic communities and their identities within the neurotypical worlds. And this tension can become an important source of anxiety and suffering. In Italy, parents and professionals pragmatically negotiate ideas about autism for different political and clinical agendas, sometimes doing so in ways that complicate what on the surface look like entrenched ideological oppositions. Despite the self-rejection of psychogenic theories of autism as derived from poor parenting, parents accept some elements of psychodynamic theory and psychoanalysis associated with relational approaches. And unlike Brazil, where psychoanalytic and behavioral approaches are opposed, there is in Italy a blending of cognitive and behavioral methodologies with relational approaches that incorporate psychodynamic theories. Additionally, the understanding of autism as both biological and relational, rooted in organic causes, but also as a different way of being, shared by parents and professionals, helps to transcend disputes between these stances. The comprehension of autism as a biological condition removes the blame from the parents while preserving the relational dimension. Moreover, the idea of autism as a different way of being does not only serve to substantiate the social model of disability and ideas of neurological difference or neurodiversity, it also boosts the call for autism-specific services and the medical model of disability. So local and historical context of the three countries, Italy, Brazil, and the United States, challenge the assumption that ideas of autism as social, relational, or as organic, biological, necessarily imply specific public policies and treatments according to its view. These views are mobilized within different political and clinical agendas according to diverse sociopolitical contexts. The actors in these accounts display a pragmatic attitude regarding ontological and epistemological commitments according to their utility to pursue the right to health and citizenship. So I'm going to just cut something here. Neurobiological descriptions alone do not determine their identity contours. For instance, the meaning of a diagnosis for autism in Brazil, even though strongly marked by a physicalist or neurobiological discourse for parents associations, not for mental health services, is not limited to reductive and stigmatizing representations. It's also the result of sociopolitical dynamics that emerge in a specific context. So I think I go now to the conclusion. So scientific ideas about autism are differently evoked in the three countries for different political and clinical ends. They are not true or false, harmful or helpful in themselves, but are pragmatically negotiated and integrated by clinicians and other mental health professionals, parent associations, as self-advocates in their struggle for better treatment, social and educational inclusion, and other rights. The same views on etiology, treatment, service organization, and even personhood have contradictory ends and are rendered harmful or helpful in a given social context, and vice versa. Opposing views on etiology, treatment, and service organizations and public policies may underlie the same practical ends. Such an approach offers the potential to move beyond dichotomies and polarizations, which may seem definitive from a distance, but which are not so definite when examined through the everyday life and practice of the individuals who are most immediately affected by the condition. It is important to emphasize that polarization in mental health hides the different negotiations that take place. When we adopt a pragmatic and reparative attitude towards theoretical frameworks, public policies, ideological positions, ways of caring, healthcare priorities, and the organization of services that are reconfigured, challenged, integrated or negotiated by medical and non-medical actors within and outside health services. This is particularly important in many countries of the global south, such as Brazil, where healthcare is chronically underfunded and families and communities face many hardships in obtaining quality health and social care for their relatives living with autism. Polarizations between ideologies and service organizations, diverse scarce resources, hinder intersectoral and professionals collaboration, and hamper the development of robust healthcare models and their implementation in local contexts, especially amongst vulnerable population. And that was all. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ortega. Thank you. And I'm sorry we couldn't give you more time. So do you feel comfortable stopping the sharing and then, we
Yes,
can
of
see?
course.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you so much. So when I had invited Dr. Ortega, I did want to get someone who will probably question a lot of starting points that, psychology or, and I also, because I come from philosophy, I also wanted to get someone who would question some of the assumptions that we might make as disciplines, right? And I really love how he had sort of teased out I think the complex, troubling sides of how we develop collective identities based on the idea of brain as a mind. And I remember reading, there was some anthology, there was a book where they talked about how Dr. Ortega argues that how humanities and social sciences transform themselves into neurodisciplines, and how that's self-defeating because they sort of disregard the complexity of their original subject areas and reduce the problematics to empirically testable neuroscientific hypothesis, right? So I'm really thank you so much, Dr. Ortega. I think you've given us quite a lot to think about, and